I'm Laura Finn, web editor of boardmember.com, and today I'm joined by Eric Morehead, Senior Compliance Counsel at Corpedia, an NYSE Euronext company. Eric, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Laura.
Today we're talking about ethics and compliance, your specialty. More and more, a data-driven approach is being used by organizations to benchmark anything, but it seems that boards and executives pay less attention to the importance of benchmarking their compliance performance programs.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that ethics and compliance is sort of late to the game with regards to a data-driven approach.
How important is benchmarking compliance performance programs to organizations?
Well, it's very important for a couple of reasons. One, how can you measure your performance if you don't have some sort of metrics by which to gauge that performance? Another reason is if you have limited resources, which most organizations do now, how are you going to allocate those resources if you don't have some sort of metric by which you can determine the need for a resource for, say, training or some other aspect of your program. And the third reason, and this is something that was reinforced just recently in the SEC, DOJ, FCPA resource guide that came out in November of 2012, is the notion that the expectation of regulators, including the Department of Justice, is that you take a data-driven approach, a risk-based approach and a data-driven approach to implementing your program. So you can't, just kind of impart, willy-nilly sort of throw your resources out there. You need to have a data-driven and a risk-based approach to your program.
And we talk about a data-driven approach. What are some particular areas that organizations should pay attention to regarding data?
You look at the structure of your program, and that's what you have, what's there. Your coverage, particularly for an international organization. You need to have some sort of comparison to know if you have all the pieces in place that you need. You can measure success also through using data. As we do in any other part of our organization, sales, marketing, product development, we use data to measure success internally, and you should be no different when you're talking about your compliance program. And again, determining resources is a big issue. How are you going to know whether if you have a limited pot of money to spend on this? You have to divvy it up in an appropriate way. And that really comes down to using two main sources of data, which are, you can get internally and then also externally.
So let's start with internal, Eric.
Okay.
What are some ways that companies can use internal data to benchmark their compliance performance programs?
Okay. I would say probably most organizations already are, to a great extent, using internal data in a couple of areas. And one of those is, and it's traditionally been training completion rates, particularly organizations that have online training as part or all of their training program. It's rather easily done because you already have a system that administers your training to keep track of completion rates. One trend, though, and I think an important trend there is, not just a total number, okay, we've got 99% or 96% of our employees have completed the training. What does that really tell you? I'm interested in just whether organizations get a little bit more granular, like, okay, we have 96% completion overall, but do we have only 30% completion in one particular division or business unit? And it's surprising the number of organizations that don't get quite that granular. So that's one thing, and that's been around for a while. The other one that's been around for a while is hotline or helpline reporting statistics.
Right.
Oftentimes boards are used to seeing, and executives are used to seeing, reports from the compliance office about how many hotline calls have come in, sort of the division of where they fall as what subject matter the complaints are about. Again, that's been around for a while, but the trend is to get a little bit more granular, and then also include reports that are open door reports that come up through HR or up through the management chain, because we know from doing surveys and otherwise measuring internally that employees across the board prefer to report to their manager. or to HR, much more than to the hotline. So if you're only getting hotline statistics, you're not getting the full picture. In fact, you're getting maybe 10% of the picture. Some surveys suggest that single digits of employees prefer the hotline as their mode of reporting. So if you're gathering incident reporting only through your hotline or helpline, and that's all that your compliance office is giving you, you're not getting what you need to get. Some other internal data that I think is really important, and this is something that organizations are doing more and more, is internal survey work. And that comes basically in two flavors. One, which we call culture assessments or culture surveys, test whether people, for instance, feel pressure to commit misconduct. If they see misconduct, do they report it? And if not, why not? For instance, do they fear retaliation? Do they think the company won't do anything about it? These are very important metrics to get to so that you can measure whether the employees down in the field are getting the message. And the other survey data that we're seeing more and more that's very valuable is what we call knowledge assessment, where the company will ask very specific questions about a risk topic like anti-corruption or harassment or whatever the topic is they want to test. Not right when the training has just been rolled out, but maybe 6 months down the road or a year down the road since that employee population has been trained, so you can gauge retention. How do you know if your training is working? Well, you test. You ask the question. How do you know if your policy makes sense to your employees, and have they read it and do they understand it? Well, you ask them the question. So that's another internal metric that's really important.
Those are really good points for people who are looking to ramp up their organizational programs. Now, you also mentioned external data.
Yes.
What is some of the external data?
External data is primarily broadly what we call benchmarking, and that's what are your peers doing. And this is very helpful for what we were talking about at the first part of the conversation, things like resources and resource allocation. What are organizations that are in the same business environment? So if you're operating in difficult environments like sub-Saharan Africa or the former Soviet Union countries or China, in particular, this is an area where we're talking about anti-corruption and other third-party issues. What are the structures that are in place that your competitors, your peers, organizations maybe in a different vertical but are operating in the same environment are doing? Organizations of a similar size, maybe similar revenue number. So you can benchmark against what they're doing to get a sense as to how you kind of fall in the spectrum. And that's a really important piece.
If I could just stop you
Sure.
there, why is it important to compare yourself to your peer organizations?
Because the government's doing the same thing. That's really what it boils down to a great extent. If a regulator is going to look at your program, your program is not the first program they've looked at. They've looked at many other programs, and they have expectations that have been built upon best practices, not just the standards we see, for instance, in the sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines is a good basis. As a former staffer of the Sentencing Commission, I'm not going to knock the sentencing guidelines in any way, but it really is the floor. The expectations that regulators have, the expectations that other stakeholders have. We're starting to see activist investors now, institutional investors that are asking about governance issues and asking about compliance issues. The consumers are interested in it. Compliance is a lot like sustainability and other corporate responsibility issues that have really come to the fore in the last 10 years. So you have a lot of stakeholders internally and externally. Your employees expect it. The younger generation of employees want to work for companies that are best in class, not only in the business environment, but best in class when it comes to ethics and compliance.
Well, Eric, you have given some really key takeaways that I think boards and executives who are watching can bring back to their organizations and say, this is where we need to start, or this is what we need to do to advance our program. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you so much for watching.